Veni Creator Spiritus, manifestor visita, implesso per la gratia, que tu creasti pectora.
Does God exist? St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God in the Summa Theologica, first part, question 2, article 3. In order to understand St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 famous arguments for the existence of God, it's important to draw a distinction between 2 kinds of arguments. There are arguments from authority. These are arguments where we draw a conclusion not by knowing why the conclusion is true, but instead by trusting the person who says it's true. And arguments from reason. These are arguments where we can see for ourselves the truth of the conclusion. Now, authorities are of 2 kinds, and therefore there are 2 kinds of arguments from authority. Sometimes we draw arguments from fallible authorities. Fallible authorities are authorities like scientists. These are people who you should trust on a given topic, but who occasionally will make mistakes. So, for instance, when a scientist is reading a scientific article, he or she is drawing an argument from authority. That's because he does not do the research himself, but instead trusts that the person who wrote the article did the research accurately and is honestly presenting their data, which is not always true. On the other hand, some authorities are not fallible, that is, prone to make mistakes or to not tell the truth, but instead infallible. Infallible authorities are authorities such as God and the Pope when speaking from the chair of St. Peter. Now, St. Thomas says that his arguments for the existence of God are not arguments from authority. Rather, they are arguments from reason. That's because it would be circular to use the authority of God to prove the existence of God, inasmuch as you trust God as an authority only insofar as you have already presupposed that God exists. Thus, the existence of God is not an article of faith, that is, something one is bound to take on authority. Rather, it is something that may be proved from reason. Now, St. Thomas's arguments, because they are not drawn from authority, are not distinct to the Christian religion, but instead are from within a tradition that includes pagan philosophers, Muslim philosophers, and Jewish philosophers. Aquinas' arguments are developed out of the arguments already presented by pagan philosophers like Aristotle, Muslim philosophers like Avicenna, and Jewish philosophers like Moses Maimonides. St. Thomas agrees with their arguments from reason. Before presenting his arguments for the existence of God, St. Thomas first presents 2 objections. Let's look at these 2 objections and Aquinas' replies. The first objection goes as follows. If one of 2 contraries is infinite, then the other cannot exist. But good is the contrary of evil. Therefore, if good is infinite, then evil cannot exist. But if God exists, then, in virtue of what we know the word God means, God would be good and infinite. Thus, if God exists, good is infinite. Thus, if God exists, evil cannot exist. But evil does exist. Therefore, God does not exist. This argument is a variation of what is popularly called the problem of evil. In short, if God is all-powerful and infinite, and he's good, then there wouldn't be any evil in the world. But there is evil, and therefore God cannot exist. The second objection is also quite popular today. The argument is that God is superfluous. It goes as follows. It is superfluous to suppose more principles than are necessary to explain what exists. But all that exists is either naturally occurring or voluntary. For instance, trees are naturally occurring, and murder is voluntary. But what is natural can be explained by nature itself, the internal principle of motion and rest. And what is voluntary can be explained by human reason or will. Therefore, it is superfluous to suppose God as a further principle over and above nature and human reason. Now that we've seen the two objections to the existence of God, let's consider how St. Thomas replies to these objections, beginning with the first one, the problem of evil. St. Thomas's reply is very short, and so we'll have to expand it a bit in order to see how it works. He says, quote, "This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist, and out of it produce good." End quote. Here's what St. Thomas means. Something can be infinite either A, in extension, or B, in essence. Now, something infinite in extension would be something like the surface of your desk, if you imagine it being extended not just to the edge of your desk, but forever and without any limit whatsoever. That would be something infinite in extension. But when we say God is infinite, we don't mean he's infinite in extension. After all, God does not have any extension at all. He's not a body, as we'll see later in the Summa. So, when we say God is infinite, we mean that he's infinite in essence, not in extension. Now, something infinite in essence is something that contains all perfection and is not limited, that is, made finite, by a particular mode of perfection. Now, if one of two contraries is infinite in the first way, that is, in extension, that would indeed exclude the other contrary from existing. For instance, if the color yellow were infinite in extension, that would certainly exclude the existence of all contrary colors, since there would be nowhere for those other colors to exist. But since God is infinite not in extension but in essence, finite created goods do not add any goodness to God. For instance, creatures are good, but by making creatures, God does not make himself any better. Likewise, finite created evils are not opposed to God any more than a shadow on earth can subtract from the sun's own brightness. Therefore, it follows from God's infinite goodness that he is capable of permitting evil in order that he may draw from it more good. That's because he is not infinite in extension, but infinite in essence. Finite created evils are not opposed to him. Rather, he can allow them to exist and draw from them more finite created goods. Now let's consider how St. Thomas responds to the second objection, namely that God is superfluous. St. Thomas responds by showing how God is neither superfluous to explain nature, nor superfluous to explain voluntary actions. Nature must be traced back to God as a higher agent, because nature acts for a determinate end, of which it itself has no knowledge. For instance, rocks always move determinately towards the center of gravity, and trees determinately shoot out roots to gather water. But neither rocks nor trees have knowledge of the good towards which they are moved by nature. Therefore, they presuppose some higher agent that does have knowledge of the end towards which they are moved. Likewise, voluntary actions are traced back to God as a higher agent, because our will and reason are changeable. But everything changeable must be traced back to something necessary and immovable. Therefore, God is superfluous for explaining neither natural things nor voluntary actions. Now that we've seen the two objections to the existence of God and how St. Thomas replies to those two objections, we can now consider the 5 arguments given by St. Thomas in proof of the existence of God. Now, these 5 arguments or proofs are traditionally called the 5 ways. So if you hear someone talking about the 5 ways, what they're talking about is the 5 proofs for the existence of God in St. Thomas's Summa Theologica. In Latin, the 5 ways are called the quinque viae. The first way, or prima via, is often called the argument from motion, or the prime mover argument. The second way, or secunda via, is often called the argument from efficient causality, or simply the argument from causality. The third way, tertia via, is often called the argument from contingency. The fourth way, or quarta via, is typically called the argument from gradations of being. The fifth way, or quinta via, is often called the argument from final causality, or the teleological argument. Teleology is just a fancy word for final causality, or the study of final causality. Now, this argument can also be called the argument from directedness. This is a more straightforward way of saying the teleological argument, because teleology is basically the same thing as directedness, or ordering towards an end or good. So these are the 5 ways and the names that are usually associated with these 5 ways. Now, each of these 5 ways relies on a certain nominal definition of the word God. So here's an example. If I want to prove that unicorns exist, I need a nominal definition of what a unicorn is. So, for instance, I'll say a unicorn is a horse with a horn coming out of its forehead. And then I'll look for things which are a horse with a horn coming out of its forehead. If I find such a thing, then I've proved the existence of a unicorn. Now, Aquinas uses a similar method when looking for whether or not God exists. He first takes a nominal definition of the word God. What do we mean when we say God? Now, there are 5 possible things we might mean, and all of these collectively are the best description of what we mean by God. St. Thomas will then go on to show that what these 5 definitions of God describe is actually in the world. So the first way, or prima via, is associated with this definition of the word God, namely, God is an unmoved mover. The first way, therefore, will show that an unmoved mover exists. But since the unmoved mover is what we mean by the word God, he has proved the existence of God by proving the existence of an unmoved mover. The second way takes a different definition of God. According to this definition, God is the first agent, that is, that by which all other agents have their capacity to cause anything. So, by showing that a first agent does exist, St. Thomas will have thereby proved that God exists. The third way takes a third definition of God. According to this definition, God is a being necessary through itself. That is, a being that's both necessary and not necessary on account of another, but on account of its own self. By proving that such a necessary being does exist, Aquinas will have proved that God exists. The fourth way takes yet a fourth definition of God. According to this definition, God is the first and noblest being. That's what we mean by the word God. But St. Thomas will prove the existence of some first and noblest being, and thereby prove the existence of God. Finally, the fifth way gives a fifth definition of God. According to this definition, God is that which governs the universe. But Aquinas will prove that there is some intellect that governs the universe, and therefore he will have proved the existence of God. Now, all 5 of these definitions collectively make for an excellent definition of God, at least as far as finite humans are capable of defining God. Thus, if you look at the 5 ways collectively, it will be overwhelmingly clear that God exists. Nevertheless, each individual way does prove something that matches a definition of the word God, and therefore each individual way does prove the existence of God. Now let's break down St. Thomas's first argument for the existence of God, the quote-unquote prime mover argument. This argument begins when Aquinas says, "The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion," end quote. This is the introduction of Aquinas' argument. It's not an actual part of the argument. But there are two things to note about this introduction. First, Aquinas says that this is going to be an argument from motion. That means motion is going to be the primary evidence in this argument for the existence of God. The second thing to note is that Aquinas says this argument is the most manifest way. That means that this is the most obvious argument for the existence of God. Presumably, it's the easiest. The conclusion of St. Thomas's argument comes when he says, "Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other. And this everyone understands to be God." Notice that this conclusion has two parts. First, he states that he has proved the existence of a first mover put in motion by no other. Next, he identifies this first mover with God. These two parts are for the reason we have already explained, namely Aquinas' procedure in proving the existence of God. His general procedure is to first state what the word God means, and then to find something corresponding to that meaning. So, since one thing the word God means is a first mover put in motion by no other, St. Thomas, by proving the existence of a first mover put in motion by no other, has thereby proved the existence of God. Everything in between this conclusion and the introduction is the actual argument for the existence of God. The argument begins when he says, "It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion." We could call this step one of Aquinas' argument, and it's the easiest step. In order to establish it, we just look around ourselves and see that some things are in motion. The leaves on the tree are rustling, the wind itself is moving, an airplane is flying by, and cars are driving. This is motion that we can see with our senses. That is step one of Aquinas' argument. Step two of Aquinas' argument comes when he says, "Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another." St. Thomas repeats himself and gives step two another time later in the argument when he says, quote, "Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another." The reason St. Thomas repeats himself is because the first time he asserts step two, and the second time he has proved step two. Everything in between the two times in which Aquinas states this principle, that whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, is Aquinas' argument for the truth of that principle. Obviously, a considerable portion of Aquinas' argument for the existence of God is Aquinas' argument for the principle that whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. We'll return to what that argument for this principle is later. For now, let it suffice to be noted that this principle is taken by Aquinas from Aristotle's book, The Physics, in which Aristotle proves the truth of this principle. Now, after stating this principle and proving it, Aquinas begins step three, which consists in clarifying something about this principle. So, in the principle, it says that whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, but not just any other suffices for producing motion. Rather, Aquinas will clarify that that other cannot be an infinite series of movers. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must be put in motion by another, and that by another again, but this cannot go on to infinity. This is step three of Aquinas' argument. It's often called the denial of an infinite regress, or an infinite regression. This is just a funny or fancy way of saying that there cannot be an infinite series of causes or an infinite series of movers resulting in something being in motion. Rather, every series of movers must be finite. From the fact that the series of movers must be finite, it follows that there's a first in the series. And if there's a first in the series, then there's a first mover put in motion by no other. And, as we've already seen, that is the conclusion of this argument. That is a proof, or that is the conclusion that God exists. So, now let's take a step back, now that we've seen the broad outline of Aquinas' argument, and look at Aquinas' argument for step 2. And then we'll look at Aquinas' argument for step 3, and then we'll once again review the overall structure of Aquinas' argument. So, step 2, that is the principle that whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, is proved with 2 steps, step A and step B. Step A is this: for nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. Step B then says, now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. From these 2 steps, it follows that whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. If something is in motion insofar as it's in potency, but something can't be in potency and act in the same respect at the same time, it follows that the mover who is in act is not the same as the thing being moved or the thing in motion. Okay, so now that we've seen the overall argument for step 2, let's look at Aquinas' arguments for the premises by which he proves step 2. So Aquinas proves step A in 2 ways. First, he confirms step A by an argument, and then he confirms it by an example. The argument is this: for motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality, except by something in a state of actuality. The confirmation by example for the same conclusion is this: thus, that which is actually hot as fire makes wood which is potentially hot to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. For instance, to make this more concrete, imagine you have a torch which is on fire, and you put that torch next to a cold chair. The cold chair is potentially hot, but actually cold. The torch, however, is actually hot. That is the fire on the torch. And so what is actually hot, namely the torch, makes the chair, which is potentially cold and actually cold and only potentially hot, to be actually hot. So what is actual makes what is potential to be actual. Put more simply, what is in motion is in potency, and what moves, or that is, the mover, is in act. The thing moved is in potency, the mover is in act. That, in other words, is step A in Aquinas' proof for the truth of step 2. Now, step B in Aquinas' argument for the truth of step 2, as we've already seen, is that it is impossible for something to be in act and in potency in the same respect at the same time. Aquinas proves this by an example. He says, for what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, in that it should move itself. Return for a moment to our example of the chair, which is lit on fire by the torch. Before the torch is brought next to the chair is potentially hot, but actually cold. Nothing can be potentially and actually the same thing at the same time in the same respect. For instance, my leg, when it's causing my body to move, is actually at rest. It's actually planted on the ground, whereas my body is being moved. Likewise, when the other leg goes to move the body, it too is planted on the ground and actually at rest, whereas the rest of the body is being moved. Nothing can be in act and in potency in the same respect at the same time. Thus, nothing can be both mover and thing in motion, or thing moved, in the same respect at the same time, because what is in motion is in potency, and what is a mover is in act. In short, we've proved the truth of step 2, which is the principle that whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, meaning not by itself, but by something else. Obviously, some things do move themselves. For instance, I move myself, but I do so because I have multiple parts, one part of which moves the other. For instance, my heart moves the blood. It's never the case that I move myself in the same respect as I am moved and mover. Okay, now that we've seen that the principle, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, is true, let's look at step 3. Step 3 is proved as follows. So recall, step 3 is that there cannot be an infinite regression of movers. Now, Aquinas says that this is because then, that is, if there were an infinite regression of movers, then there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers only move inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover. So, in other words, because intermediate movers depend on the first mover, if there is no first mover, intermediate movers will not move at all. They won't be movers. So, since an infinite series of movers would require that there be no first mover, there cannot be an infinite series of movers. Therefore, since there must be a mover, insofar as we see things that are being moved, it follows that there must be a first mover and not just some infinite series of movers moving what we see being moved. Now, Aquinas supports this argument by an example. He says, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. What Aquinas has in mind here is someone who has a staff in his hand and is poking something. So the staff is, for instance, poking a rock. The rock is being moved by the staff, but the staff is only itself moving the rock insofar as it itself is being moved by the hand. The hand itself is only moving the staff insofar as it itself is being moved by something else, and so on. There cannot be an infinite series, but we must come to a first mover, which itself is unmoved. Therefore, as Aquinas says in his conclusion, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. So that's Aquinas' argument for the existence of God. The argument, in general, if we look at the broad outline of it, begins with step 1, namely, we look around ourselves and observe motion. Step 2 is that we recognize the philosophical principle that whatever is in motion must be put in motion by something else, that is, by another. In step 3, St. Thomas clarifies that that other cannot be an infinite series of movers, but must be either one mover or a series that terminates in a first mover. Therefore, we've proved the existence of a first mover put in motion by no other. And this is what we mean by the word God. And therefore, we've proved the existence of God. Now let's look a little more closely at what Aquinas means when he says that there cannot be an infinite series of movers. This goes to Aquinas' more general principle that there cannot be an infinite per se series of causes. What does that mean? Well, first let's understand what the difference is between a per se or essential series of causes is and an accidental or per accident series. An accidental or per accident series of causes is a series in which each cause in the series is capable of itself of producing the effect. For instance, a great-grandfather causes a grandfather, and the grandfather causes the father, and the father causes the effect, the child. Each step in this series is capable of itself of producing the next step. It's not the case that the grandfather, in order to produce the father, requires the help of the great-grandfather. There can, in Aquinas' mind, be an infinite per accidens series of causes. There's no problem with, in principle, with a series of causes going back forever, from child, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, and so on. That could, in principle, go on forever. Aquinas, in fact, doesn't think that you can prove the world has a temporal beginning, that is, a beginning in time, precisely for the reason that it's possible that you could have a per accident series of causes going back forever in time. So that is not what Aquinas means when he says that there cannot be an infinite regression of movers. Rather, what Aquinas is talking about is an essential or per se series of causes. This is a series in which each intermediate cause only causes in virtue of the power of antecedent causes in the series. For instance, imagine a boy with a stick pushing a rock and pushing grass by means of the stick and the rock. The blade of grass moves. That is the final effect. But this effect is brought about via the rock moving, which is brought about via the stick moving, which is brought about via the hand moving, which is brought about via the mind moving. Because the mind moves the hand moves the stick, and because the hand moves the stick moves the rock, and because the stick moves the rock moves the grass. But if it were not for the mind moving the hand, moving the stick, moving the rock, the grass would not be moved by the rock. So the steps in this series do not of themselves bring about the effect, but depend on prior steps for their own causality. Here's a perhaps better example. Imagine a ball suspended in air. This is a final effect, but this effect is brought about by the lowest chain suspended in air. And the lowest chain suspended in air is suspended precisely because the middle chain is suspended in air, but the middle chain is suspended in air because it is sustained by the highest chain on the link of chains. And that highest chain is itself suspended in air because the ceiling is suspended in air, and it is fixed to the ceiling. But the ceiling itself is suspended in air only because the walls hold up the ceiling. Notice that on each step along this chain of cause and effect, none of the steps explains itself, but is dependent on an earlier effect or an earlier cause or mover in order to bring about the motion that it itself causes. If we just had the ball suspended in air and the lowest chain suspended in air, it would make no sense. The lowest chain cannot be suspended in air of itself, and if it itself is not suspended in air, it won't suspend the ball in air. So the lowest chain depends for its causality on the middle chain, and the middle chain depends for its causality on the highest chain, and the highest chain depends for its causality on the ceiling, and that itself depends for its causality on the walls which are holding up the ceiling. So if any step along this series of causes is removed, the final effect would be lost. And most importantly, if the first cause is removed, the entire series is lost, including the final effect. If the walls do not hold up the ceiling, it's impossible for the ball to be suspended in the air. Notice that this is very different from the case of the great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and child, whereas the middle chain and the highest chain are intermediate movers, which, in order to bring about motion, depend on some prior mover. The father does not depend on the grandfather in order to produce the child. In fact, the grandfather might already be dead. But if the highest chain is already destroyed, then the middle chain will certainly not do any good in holding up the ball in the air. When Aquinas says that there is no infinite series of movers, he's talking about an infinite series of per se causes. Aquinas does not think that an infinite series of per se causes is ever possible. The reason should be pretty clear. In a per se series of causes, the intermediate causes depend for their causality upon prior causes. Thus, if there is no first cause, which does not depend on any other, none of the intermediate causes will even be able to be causes. The principle that there cannot be an infinite series or infinite per se series of causes will be invoked again in several of Aquinas' subsequent proofs for the existence of God. So it's important to understand what it means. Now let's look a little more closely at what exactly the first way proves. We know it proves God, but as we saw, it proves God under a certain definition of the word God. What does this amount to? To understand this, we have to understand that motion is defined by Aristotle as the act of a being in potency inasmuch as it is in potency. Or, put in a briefer form, we could say motion is the act of a being in potency as such. Thus, all moved or mobile things are in potency to the degree that they are mobile. But the first argument for the existence of God proves that there is something that is not mobile, which moves all other things. Thus, inasmuch as we call this first unmoved mover God, God is something that is pure act and entirely immobile, that is, without any potency whatsoever to be changed. So all creatures have some admixture of potency, that is, they can be moved or changed in some respect. But God is not a combination of actuality and potency, but he is pure act. Now that we've looked at the first argument for the existence of God, let's consider Aquinas' second argument for the existence of God. As we saw, this argument is sometimes called the argument from efficient causality, or simply the argument from causality. The argument runs as follows, quote, "Thus the second way is from the nature of the efficient cause. In the world of sense, we find that there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself, for so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes, following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several, or only one. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate, nor any intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God." End quote. Now let's break down Aquinas' second argument for the existence of God, the argument from causality. The introduction to the argument reads as follows, quote, "The second way is from the nature of the efficient cause," end quote. This not only gives the principal evidence that will be used in this argument, but also suggests how this argument differs from the first argument. Superficially, the two arguments look very similar, and that's because they do proceed in a rather similar way. Nevertheless, they are not exactly the same argument. In the first argument, Aquinas proved something that was pure act, that was an unmoved mover, and the source of all motion. In this argument, Aquinas is not looking at the cause of motion as such. Rather, he's looking at the cause of things being movers, or more generally, things being efficient causes. So he's not looking at that by which things are in motion, first and foremost. Rather, he's looking at that by which things are capable of making other things to be in motion. The cause of causality. Thus, Aquinas' first step is to point out the existence of an order of efficient causes. He says, in the world of sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. To confirm the truth of this, we need only look around us at the world of sense. Take, for example, a boy who's entertaining an audience with puppets. The puppets entertain the audience. Thus, they are efficient causes of amusement. But so too is the boy an efficient cause of amusement. But the boy and the puppets are not efficient causes of amusement in the same respect. The boy is prior to the puppets in the order of efficient causes here, since the puppets only entertain the audience by being moved by the boy. So, the boy causes the causality of the puppets. He is prior to the puppets in the order of efficient causality, although both are efficient causes. Step 2 in Aquinas' argument consists in this. He says, quote, "There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself," end quote. This is pretty straightforward. Nothing can cause itself. Aquinas proves this by saying, quote, "For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible," end quote. In other words, every efficient cause is prior to its effect. But nothing can be prior to itself. Therefore, nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. Now, step 3 runs as follows, quote, "Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity," end quote. This is basically what we've just been discussing, namely, the impossibility of an infinite per se series of causes. Aquinas justifies it at length by saying, quote, "Because in all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there is no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate, nor any intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false." From these steps, then, Aquinas draws the conclusion. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God, end quote. This conclusion, as we already suggested, proves God by proving the existence of something which is the efficient cause by which all other efficient causes have their causality. In other words, Aquinas shows that there is a first agent by which all other agents are capable of being agents, that is, capable of being the source of change and motion. Since God, in one sense of the word, means something which is a first agent by which all other things are capable of being agents, that is, a first efficient cause, Aquinas, by proving the existence of such a thing, has thereby proved the existence of God. Now that we've discussed the first and second argument for the existence of God, we must discuss the third. This is called the argument from contingency. The argument is introduced as follows, quote, "The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus." In other words, whereas the source of evidence for the first argument was motion and the source of evidence for the second argument was efficient causality, the source of evidence for this argument is possibility and necessity. Aquinas says in step 1, quote, "We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be." He justifies this saying, quote, "Since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be," end quote. Step 2 comes when he says, quote, "But it is impossible for these always to exist," end quote. In other words, it's impossible for things that are capable of being generated and corrupted to always exist. He justifies step 2 by saying, quote, "For that which is possible not to be at some time is not," end quote. From this, he draws his conclusion in step 3, quote, "Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence," end quote. This is step 3 of his argument. Step 4 of his argument is as follows, quote, "Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence," end quote. And he justifies step 4 by saying, quote, "Because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing," end quote. From this, he draws a conclusion which will support step 4. He says, quote, "Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist, and thus even now nothing would be in existence," which is, of course, absurd. Aquinas draws a conclusion which constitutes step 5 of this argument. Quote, "Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary," end quote. Step 6 begins when Aquinas says, quote, "But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not," end quote. This leads to step 7. Quote, "Now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has been already proved in regard to efficient causes," end quote. Here again we see the principle of there not being any infinite per se series of causes. Thus, Aquinas draws his grand conclusion, quote, "Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This," says Aquinas, "all men speak of as God," end quote. In other words, Aquinas has proved, first, that there must be some necessary thing to explain things which are coming to be and passing away, and why they haven't all passed away by now. But among necessary things, some necessary things are necessary through themselves, and others are necessary by depending on something prior. but there cannot be an infinite series of necessary things. Thus we must come to some first necessary thing that is not necessary by another, but by itself. But something necessary through itself is what we mean by the word God, and therefore Aquinas has proved the existence of God. Aquinas' third way is heavily based on his medieval geocentric cosmology, which is no longer accepted nor familiar today. And therefore, in order to explain his third way, it's important to say something about the medieval cosmology. According to this medieval cosmology, beings below the moon, which are called sublunary beings, for obvious reasons, are contingent both with respect to their being and with respect to motion. These are things like trees, humans, and acorns. All of these come to be and pass away, and for that reason are called contingent, simply speaking, or contingent with respect to their being. But they also are contingent with respect to their place. They don't always remain in the same location. Above sublunary beings are the celestial bodies, or heavenly bodies. These are things such as the moon, sun, and stars. They are necessary in Aquinas' mind in respect of their being, but not in respect of their location or place. So, in Aquinas' view, they cannot be destroyed, but they do change their location or place. Nowadays, and since the discovery of the telescope, we know that the celestial bodies can be destroyed. But it was reasonable prior to the discovery of the telescope to suppose that they couldn't be. Above the celestial bodies are the angels, or spirits, or intelligences, whatever you call them. These are substances without matter. As such, they are necessary in their being, but contingent with respect to mental operations, such as knowing and willing. In other words, angels, like the heavenly bodies, but unlike sublunary beings, are incapable of passing away. They are necessary in their being. Nevertheless, there is a respect in which they are contingent, namely in their mental operations, just as the heavenly bodies were contingent in respect of their location, inasmuch as they move. Above the angels is God, who is necessary through himself and therefore is in no way changeable. In other words, God is not changeable either with respect to being, nor with respect to mental operations, nor with respect to his location, nor with respect to his being. Notice that both God, the angels, and the celestial bodies in Aquinas' view are all called necessary beings. The only things that aren't called necessary beings are the sublunary beings, such as trees, humans, and acorns. Nevertheless, there's a distinction between the way God is a necessary being and the way angels and the celestial bodies are necessary beings. God is necessary through himself and not in dependence on another. He is necessary in his essence. Whereas the angels and the celestial bodies, insofar as they have some respect in which they are contingent, are not necessary through themselves, but participate necessity. They receive their necessity when they are created by God, and their necessity is through God's own causality. So, God is necessary through himself, and angels and celestial bodies are necessary through another, namely through God. God communicates necessity to them. Notice, then, that Aquinas' third way reasons as follows. It begins with the motion of sublunary beings. It starts with their contingency. And it says that among sublunary beings, if there were no necessary being, all of the sublunary beings would eventually pass away. There would be no more humans, no more trees, no more acorns. All earth would be dead. But the contingent beings are not by themselves. They have some other thing above them, namely the necessary beings. And so the reason why all things on earth haven't passed away is because there are the necessary celestial bodies, which, through their motion, continually bring things on earth back to life. Consider, for instance, the seasons. If it was perpetual winter, everything would be destroyed. Likewise, if it was perpetual summer, everything would be destroyed. Through the change of the seasons, things come to life and are regenerated on earth. And so the contingent beings are kept in existence by the motion of the necessary beings, namely the celestial bodies. But among necessary beings there is a hierarchy. Some necessary beings are necessary through another, and those must be referred to what is necessary through itself, namely God. So, the very existence of contingent things requires that there be something, ultimately, which is necessary through itself, and that is God. This, in short, is how the third way argues to the existence of God. Although Aquinas' third way, or third argument, is based on a mistaken geocentric cosmology, many contemporary authors argue that the proof still basically works and can be adapted to our modern understanding of the universe. At this point, we've seen Aquinas' first argument for the existence of God, which was based on the evidence of things being in motion, and his second argument for the existence of God, based on the evidence of the observation of orders or chains of efficient causality, as well as his third argument for the existence of God, which took for its evidence the existence of contingent beings. Now we move on to Aquinas' fourth way, or fourth argument for the existence of God. Here, as Aquinas indicates in his introductory sentence, the principal evidence in this argument will be the gradation to be found among beings. Aquinas says, quote, "Among beings there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like." End quote. This is step one of Aquinas' argument. We could take, for example, the fact that a tree is clearly more good and noble than a rock, and a rock more good and noble than an atom, and a human more good and noble than a tree. Thus, there are gradations in goodness, truth, and nobility. Here by true, Aquinas means something being more knowable. So, for instance, a very complicated topic in mathematics is more knowable than a more simple topic. For instance, 1 plus 1 equals 2 is true, but it has less truth than a more complicated formula, which contains more that can be known. So there are gradations both in nobility and in truth among the things that we observe. But, Aquinas goes on to say, more and less are predicated of different things according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum. This is step 2 of Aquinas' argument. In other words, if there's a comparison among beings, that is only possible insofar as there is some standard or maximum, which is that by which the comparison is made. Aquinas confirms this by saying, quote, "As a thing is said to be hotter according as it is more nearly in resemblance to that which is hottest," end quote. From this, Aquinas draws the conclusion, quote, "So that there is something which is truest, something best, and something noblest," end quote. This is step 3 of Aquinas' argument, and it follows from step 2 and step 1. But then he draws a further conclusion, step 4, where he says, quote, "and consequently something which is uttermost being." After drawing the conclusion of step 4, he explains how this follows from step 3, saying, quote, "For those things are greatest in truth, are greatest in being, as it is written in Metaphysics 2, end quote. Here Aquinas is citing his sources, namely, he's referring to Aristotle's book 2 of the Metaphysics. In that book, Aristotle says that what is most true is also most a being. Here again, the word truth is being used in the way we discussed earlier, not in the ordinary sense of the word true. Here, true means most knowable, that about which there is more that can be known. So something which is more true, in this sense of the word true, is also most a being. Now Aquinas moves on to step 5. Quote, now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus. End quote. Thus, what we've shown is that there is some maximum inasmuch as there's a comparison among beings, and comparison requires some maximum by which the comparison can be made. And now we're saying that it's the case that the maximum must be the cause of everything else in the genus, that is, of all the things that are referred to it. Here Aquinas confirms step 5 by an example. Quote, as fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. End quote. We'll come back to this example on the next slide. From step 5, Aquinas draws the ultimate conclusion. Quote, therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. Obviously, if we have shown the existence of something which is the cause of all being, goodness, and every other perfection, this can hardly be anything but God. But Aquinas has just shown the existence of something which is the cause of all being, goodness, and every other perfection. Therefore, Aquinas has shown the existence of God. Just as with the third way, some of Aquinas' fourth way involves mistaken medieval science. The example by which Aquinas proves the principle that whatever is a maximum in any genus is the cause of the rest is this, namely that fire is what is the maximum in the genus of hot things, and all hot things are therefore hot by either by being fire or by participating fire, that is, by having fire enter into their matter or by being touched by fire. Here, what Aquinas had in mind, for instance, would be a bowl of water. The water in itself is neutral with respect to either being hot or cold. In fact, it inclines towards being cold inasmuch as if you leave it alone, it'll start to get cold. But if you want it to become hot, you have to make a fire and bring the fire close to the water, and then by participating the fire, the water will become hot. The fire, however, does not need to be made hot by anything else. It's just hot by itself. That's the reasoning that Aquinas has in mind here when he gives an example to prove the principle that whatever is maximum in any genus, such as the genus of hot things, is the cause of all the rest. Today, however, we know that things are not hot by participation in fire, strictly speaking. Nevertheless, Aquinas' example is not far from the truth. It is true that things only have energy, whether that be heat energy or some other kind of energy, by participation in electromagnetic radiation, which has energy through itself, not by participation in something else. So, just as in Aquinas' day, it remains true that what is maximum in a genus is the cause of the rest. In other words, Aquinas' argument is not undermined by the outdated science of a few of his examples. Now that we've seen the first 4 arguments for the existence of God, we can move on to Aquinas' 5th and last argument for the existence of God. This is usually called the teleological argument. Teleology is just a fancy word for the study of ends or goals or goods or purposes. That's because it's taken from the Greek word telos, which just means end or goal. In the introduction to the argument, Aquinas says, the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. Then he says, we see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. This can be called step 1 of Aquinas' argument. The observation of things around us and seeing that those things which are natural and which lack intelligence move towards an end. They have some sort of goal. Aquinas proves this by saying, quote, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to obtain the best result, end quote. In other words, we look at things around us, natural things without intelligence, and see that they act in a regular and consistent way. Aquinas goes on to say, quote, hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly do they achieve their end, end quote. This is step 2 of Aquinas' argument. Step 3 of Aquinas' argument goes as follows, quote, now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. Aquinas supports this by an example, quote, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer, end quote. In other words, the arrow does not of itself move towards a goal. Rather, it must be directed by something with knowledge of the goal. So when the arrow moves towards the goal of the target, this is because it has been moved by the archer towards that goal. The reason the arrow cannot move of itself towards that target is because the arrow lacks intelligence. But the archer can move it towards that target because the archer does not lack intelligence. Here Aquinas draws his grand conclusion, quote, therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God, end quote. Here, the nominal definition of God that is in play is that of an intelligent being which governs or directs to an end all natural things. Obviously, if we should prove the existence of something which governs the whole natural world and moves all natural things towards their end, that thing would certainly deserve the name God. But Aquinas has proved such a thing. Therefore, he has proved the existence of God. Now, among Aquinas' 5 ways, this last 5th way has probably attracted the most attention from non-philosophers or popular philosophers in modern times. And it has received several objections. So we're going to look at what those objections are and give a brief response. Some philosophers deny either A, that natural things do move towards an end, or B, that something that moves towards an end needs to be moved by something intelligent, that is, something with knowledge of the end. These philosophers are often influenced by the tradition of British empiricist philosophy, that is, the tradition of David Hume, John Locke, and Bertrand Russell. These philosophers often claim Darwinian evolution or unguided free market economics as the justification for their denial of the teleological argument. This objection, however, does not work. First of all, natural things do act for an end. To see this, a few things should be considered. First of all, Darwinian evolution has 2 aspects which should not be conflated with one another. On the one hand, there is the empirical evidence that species did evolve over time. On the other hand, there is the philosophical assumption that this evolution over time was unguided. This is an assumption without any evidence or argument in support of it, and it is not necessary to the empirical evidence that species did evolve over time. The two are unrelated and unconnected. The second thing to note is that modern biologists, chemists, and physicists rely on the fact that natural things act for an end all of the time. These disciplines, in fact, would not be possible if it weren't for teleology. For instance, biologists define the mitochondria by its end or purpose, namely, to generate the chemical energy needed to power the cell's biochemical reactions. Likewise, chemists recognize that electrons are attracted to protons. Finally, physicists define potential energy in reference to kinetic energy, which is that to which something with potential energy is inclined as an end. The examples could go on nearly all day. All of the modern scientific disciplines rely heavily on teleology. Secondly, what acts for an end must either know the end or be guided by something that does know the end, and is therefore intelligent. This can be seen from the following considerations. First of all, the success of free market economies does not contradict this principle. Free markets may not be guided entirely by a central government, but they are guided by the consumers who indicate to companies the ends or goods they desire. So it's not the case that free market economies are entirely without guidance. Moreover, to deny this philosophical principle that things which act for an end must be guided by something intelligent, that is, something with knowledge at the end, is also to deny the principle employed in every science and in everyday reasoning that every effect must be referred to a cause sufficient to explain that effect. Denying this principle would undermine all science. So, for the reasons we've just given, we must affirm both that natural things do act for an end, and secondly, that what acts for an end must either know the end or be guided by something that does know the end, that is, something intelligent. Since natural things by definition are not intelligent, it follows that there must be some intelligent thing which directs natural things towards the end towards which they move. Now that we've explained the objections to the existence of God, Aquinas' replies to those objections, and Aquinas' 5 arguments for the existence of God, it remains to ask what we have proved by these 5 arguments. First thing to note is that these 5 arguments do not, by themselves, determinately prove the Trinitarian God of Christianity or the non-Trinitarian God of any other religion. To prove that, it would be necessary to suppose special revelation. Recall that these arguments were all based on reason, not on God's authority. So, since they are from reason, they start with sensible things and conclude to what we can know about God just from the natural world around us. Thus, those hidden aspects of God, such as his Trinitarian nature, cannot be known by us unless we had some special revelation, that is, unless God revealed them to us. Nevertheless, the 5 ways do prove the existence of something, which is 1. Pure act in an unmoved mover, 2. The first agent by which all other efficient causes have the capacity to cause anything whatsoever, 3. A being necessary through itself, 4. The first and noblest being by participation in which all other beings are beings, 5. The intellect that governs all natural things. We would call something that met any one of these descriptions by the name God, but certainly the thing that matches all of these descriptions together is God. With that said, this article in the Summa Theologica has only proved that God exists, not what he is. The rest of St. Thomas's treatise on God in the Summa Theologiae is devoted to drawing conclusions about what God is, that is, his attributes, from the conclusions reached in this article, which was concerned only with the bare existence of God, not his essence. Thus, if someone is not satisfied that what's been proved in these 5 ways is in fact God, they would have to test their theory by continuing to read the treatise on God and the Summa Theologiae. Later in the treatise, Aquinas will prove from the conclusions of these 5 arguments that the thing proved in these 5 arguments is all perfect, contains all the perfections of all creatures, is infinite, immobile, eternal, one, all-knowing and all-powerful, and many other attributes. Given all these attributes follow from the 5 ways, it's clear that what was proved in the 5 ways was in fact God. But this is not seen sufficiently by the 5 ways in themselves. To see this, you have to continue to read the treatise on God, which is a much longer work than just this one article proving the existence of God.
Quid